Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and we're going to continue our look at the Great Depression, our analysis of the Great Depression, and in particular the Roosevelt years, the New Deal's impact on the Great Depression. And with that being said, I'd like to dive right into where we left off in the last lecture. And in our last lecture, we looked at two of the main acts. The first two of the main acts of the first New Deal. That would be the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, which created the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which established industrial codes for various industries to spur the economic recovery evenly in the Republic. And of course, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was created to back farmers, to ensure that farmers were compensated in the event of crop failures, and of course to make sure that their crop that they got to market, that they got top dollar, that they got the best possible value for those crops that were brought to market. And jumping off, well, not really jumping off, but picking up right from where we left off in the last lecture, the New Deal succeeded at keeping crop prices high, and farmers responded by increasing production. Banking and finance was also addressed by the New Deal. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC, was created to insure bank deposits. The Federal Housing Administration Bank was established to ensure that Americans could get access to home loans. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate trading on the stock market. And again, this holds over because many people attributed the stock market crash in 1929 as the root cause of the Depression. So they wanted to address that, and the SEC was how they sought to address that. The Glass-Steagall Act, which limited what banks could do, like investing in stock markets or fuel economic speculation, was also enacted. Bank investing is not generally cited or acknowledged as the source of the Depression. I just wanted to say that. And most banks outside the United States, they play an active role in their nation's economies. A lot of them serve as the central bank of deposit for their respective countries, and they also take a vital role in lending out money or investing money in several major national corporations or even multinational corporations. The Federal Communication Commission was created to regulate radio and the telegraph. The Civil Aeronautics Board was created to regulate plane fares. Interstate Commerce Commission, which was already regulating the railroads, now began to regulate the new trucking industry. So we see, especially with as the New Deal went on, was that the Roosevelt administration began to take a very direct oversight role in the nation's economy. They began to take this active interest in ensuring that at all levels there was propriety. At all levels of the nation's economy, in all aspects of the nation's economy. Unions were also substantially empowered by the New Deal. As we have covered, the rise of unions in the United States was a tumultuous affair. We discussed the trials that the unions had to endure in gaining recognition and acceptance from the 1870s onward. There was a practice of having workers sign yellow dog contracts, which were contracts that stated that the workers were not to join a union. If you didn't sign the yellow dog contract, then you would not be given a job. And signing of the contract, by signing this yellow dog contract, you voluntarily gave up your right to join an organization that could lobby on your behalf for better wages and better working conditions. Legislation quickly came out that made yellow dog contracts illegal. The big act that spurred unions was the Wagner Act. Now, the Wagner Act gave unions the undisputed right to organize, hold elections, get certified, and establish a National Labor Relations Board. In 1930, unions covered only about 12% of all American workers. By 1940, it was closer to 30%. During the New Deal, unions saw major breakthroughs. As one in particular was at the General Motors plant and the U.S. Steel plants. The unions there were able to push through. Were able to push through their initiatives on those two companies and made great breakthroughs in other industries. Now, two of the biggest and most long-lasting and enduring legacies of the New Deal are Social Security and welfare. The New Deal created social and income support programs. In 1935, the Social Security Act was passed, which was a tense moment because the Supreme Court was striking down many of the first New Deal laws. They were deeming them unconstitutional and removing them from the political landscape. The Constitution does not provide for many of the government programs or acts. The Constitution also does not state that the federal government has the right to establish a Social Security mechanism. To get around this, two separate systems were established. One was a tax on businesses, and the other was a system of old age benefits. In 1935, there was no link between the two because of fears that the Supreme Court would rule it unconstitutional. Now, this arrangement was changed in 1938 when the court ruled it acceptable. The Social Security program was not a system where the government stores your personal money in an account for you in some distant, far-off location. The way that Social Security system works is that all the money is paid into the system and then immediately paid out. Or at least that's how it originally worked. Because so many people are working, because so much is taken in wages, that excess money accrued or accrues. But the way it was envisioned back in the 1930s was that workers pay into it, and the money is immediately paid out to those who meet its requirements, who meet its minimum requirements. The way the system is designed is that it uses current workers to pay off current retirees. A system like that can be, and really the main flaw, something that a lot of people sort of get worried about, is that a system like that can be in for serious trouble if the number of retirees and the numbers of workers gets jumbled. That is, if you have more people who meet the minimum requirements of Social Security, but you don't have enough people working to actually be taxed adequately to pay in to Social Security. The same act made provisions for aid to dependent children, which would later be amended and come to commonly be known as welfare. It was a minor part of the 1935 legislation, and now it's a major part of our domestic policy in the United States. Now, other New Deal acts include the Work Program Administration, the Civilian Corps Administration. Minimum wage was also part of the New Deal, a major part of the New Deal. And the first minimum wage acts were passed as part of the Fair Labor Act, which also contained provisions that guaranteed overtime pay. Now, the first minimum wages were set at 32.5 cents per hour. The thing to remember about wages was that wages were generally highest in the Great Lakes and Eastern Atlantic Seaboard and lowest in the southeastern states. Among workers outside the southeastern states, about 6% were being paid less than the minimum wage when the law came into effect. But in these southeastern states, that number was closer to 50% being paid at or below that 32.5 cents an hour wage. An examination of congressional votes showed the very sectional vote reminiscent of the voting patterns that led up to the Civil War. Then and now, there's talk about ensuring that workers earn enough to support their families, but there was a great fear that jobs were going to migrate out to the southeast, from the Midwest, the Great Lakes states, and so forth. So the act was passed. Now, when this act was passed, it had the terrible effect of seeing the Dixiecrats put African American workers out of work, so that they would not have to pay them the minimum wage. It was and really throughout this period, and even now, African American workers are viewed as the most expendable. And a social sort of shock, a social sort of kickback to the African American worker, the majority of African American workers being put out of work because of this new minimum wage act, was that it kickstarted what's known as the Second Great Migration in the 1930s. Now, with the passage of the New Deal, the economy hit rock bottom in 1933. And the Republic just sort of staggers through 1934. Things improve in 1936, but then things go back down around the middle of 1937, around August of 1937. Things start to go back down. Had the stock market again crashes. Now, industrial capacity drops and unemployment soars once again. There were tax increases on the rich, which bit into the buying power. Veteran benefits dried up, and the Federal Reserve began to worry that banks are holding on to extra reserve notes than is actually federally required of them. They were worried that this would lead to inflation, so they raised the minimum amount of reserves that were federally mandated to be kept on hand. Now that only hurt the economic situation, only made things worse. Has more buying power at this time, and more credit was lost because of that move by the Federal Reserve. Now, there are many aspects of the New Deal that are admirable. Social Security really is a great success story. It still is a great success story. The SEC was needed to make sure that fair dealing in the financial markets occurred. The social aspects of the New Deal are truly outstanding, but the New Deal was not about growth or helping the economy recover. Much of the regulatory the regulatory aspect of the New Deal, much of that was negative for growth. It was disastrous, really. Roosevelt, when questioned about its National Industrial Recovery Act, said its purpose was to shorten the working week, to pay a decent wage for a shorter week, to prevent unfair competition and disastrous overproduction, which is illogical in economic terms. It is not very feasible to produce a lot less goods, keep the prices of said goods really high while paying workers high wages, and expect everything to work out. It really doesn't really gel. But that was Roosevelt's line of thinking, and as I alluded to in previous lectures, Roosevelt really wasn't the thought man behind a lot of these projects, these plans. He was the man who was sent out, who had enough charisma and charm to get people to buy into it, to get people to believe these sort of things. Interestingly, when it came to the New Deal Acts that were ruled unconstitutional in 1935, when those acts were ruled unconstitutional, the economy began to recover. Moreover, Roosevelt's plan failed to get at the macro economic issues at all. He did not address the Federal Reserve or attempt to help the federal money supply increase. Most importantly, he did not use the buying power of the federal government at all in any of his schemes to lift the economy out of the Depression. When the federal government was at hand, when federal dollars were at hand, they were used sparingly. They were used at bare minimum. Roosevelt really cannot be faulted for the faulting of addressing the macroeconomic issues, because macroeconomics was not invented, was not known by the men of his generation. So you really can't blame him for his failure to examine on that front. He thought that cutting competition, fixing wages and prices, and lowering production would lead to a boom, which sadly it did not. Now, Hoover edges Roosevelt in direct comparison regarding fighting the Depression and the benefits of their economic policies in fighting the Depression. Hoover embarked on the ambitious public works projects to put people to work. Hoover established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to lend money to private businesses, banks, and so forth. Hoover also ran the largest budget deficit of any of his predecessors. He had a better understanding of macroeconomics, even though such a term did not exist at the time. He did what he could to ensure that credit and buying power was available, whereas Roosevelt had a better sense of the urgency in that he tried everything hoping that something would stick. And that does it. That wraps up our lectures on the Depression. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about it. And as always, I am Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.